Welcome, 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 housers. I think that's the new term we're using for people that house people and others who enjoy listening to this podcast. If you're looking for a different podcast, this is On the Way Home, and maybe you're sitting in traffic and you want to kill 20 to 30 minutes. This is the podcast for you. Or maybe you're just sitting down on a Saturday with a cup of coffee. You care about housing, health, and all the things wrapped around that. This is the right place to be. We are so fortunate on this podcast to have some amazing people from across Canada, from around the world, who are stepping up to the challenge we face within this housing crisis, offering solutions, helping us work through this, looking towards a future that is much brighter. And today's guests are no exception to that. Incredible people doing incredible work. I'm so excited about this conversation. Listen, we throw around a lot of numbers when it comes to homelessness. This week, we saw out of London, Ontario, they were talking about 250,000 Canadians. It's usually the estimated number of people experiencing homelessness across the country. The research out of London, Ontario said they believe it is triple that number. So 750,000 Canadians. And that's not great news, but we've always known that the numbers of the point in time count might be a little thin moving forward. But when we talk about numbers lately, we talk about housing, especially in Ontario, the number 23 rings a big bell, right? And that's because of the More Homes Built Faster Act. It has like a bit of a caveman ring to it, More Homes Built Faster, but better known as Bill 23. And that has just been pushed through in Ontario, and lots of people have lots to say about this bill. There's some people that are very, very happy about it, and others not so much. And so we have with us today, we have John Fox, who's the managing partner at Robbins Appleby, and Leilani Farha, who's the global director at The Shift. Both are lawyers. And what do you get when you get two lawyers on this podcast? A great podcast. That's what we have. So Leilani and John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And you've both been on the podcast before, so you're a return guest. Unlike Saturday Night Live, we don't have Five Timers Club jacket or a little robe, but we'll work on something, maybe a mug. The first question we always ask, because it's important and because it's a little different for everyone, and Leilani, we'll start with you and then go to John, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Yeah, so these days, I guess I'm starting to finally, after so many years of work in this area, I'm finally understanding home as a very profound thing. I actually think home is a kind of feeling, and if I had to describe it in more material terms, I'd say it's whatever place brings you peace, security, and dignity.
Wow, that is beautifully said. John, thoughts?
Although it's tempting just to say yes, I would express it as this. It's a place where I feel safe and secure and can recharge to meet the challenges of the next day. And one thing about being in this sector, we treasure that all the more because we know that many people can't take that for granted.
Also well said. So today, as we talk about home, there is, of course, a push across the nation. The federal government, I believe, has talked about building 3 million homes in the next 10 years. In the province of Ontario, the goal is 150,000 homes per year, up from, I believe, we around 100,000. Now, our minister, Steve Clark of Municipal Affairs and Housing, said this act claims to address the province's severe housing crisis by cutting through the red tape involved in the development process, with the goal of getting 150,000 homes built each year. While we touch on the areas of concern around this bill, and I mentioned a little bit, I'm hoping we can really start with both of you as what are the positive? Who are the winners coming out of this? Because there definitely are some winners, and let's look at, like, there's, obviously we need housing, but what are some of the positives? Who are the winners? John, we'll start with you this time.
Well, first of all, it's a really big act, is one of the most important things to recognize, and it's easy to get confused because you'll hear about many different aspects of it, whether it's the green belt, housing, and so on. It's binding philosophy. is pretty simple. Their housing starts today in Ontario are about 75,000 housing starts a year. And housing starts that you need in order to achieve 1.5 million homes over that period is 150,000 starts. So it's a pretty big challenge in and of itself to double the number of houses created in Ontario every single year. And if that's your starting point, then you walk through this bill and you say, okay, every single thing we're doing here is to make it easier and less expensive to create housing. And so in that regard, you know, at a certain level, the supply is going to help people acquire homes at different places, particularly those who are living on the margin, who just barely can't make a home purchase or rent a home today. So if you add supply, then it should, in theory, push down prices at that market level. So if you're looking for winners, certainly you can look to the development industry, because it will make it less expensive and easier to start, and they start when they can make money. So which is appropriate, and so they will be able to bring more properties into development, which is the intent of the Act.
Thank you for that. Leilani, thoughts?
Well, I was going to start in a different place. I was going to start with Mr. Clark's words. You know, he says that the Act aims to address the province's severe housing crisis by cutting the red tape and building 150,000 homes per year. So I think, for me, he misdiagnosed the crisis. So he implies that the crisis is caused by a lot of red tape and caused by a lack of generalized supply. I mean, general supply, right? And I just don't agree that those are, in fact, significant causes of the housing crisis. I think red tape is a problem, and obviously it's good to get rid of some of the sort of stupid and cumbersome and expensive rules that are inhibiting some development. But I think that what's really at the root of the problem is far more systemic than what's been diagnosed here. And I mean, it's everything from exceptionally low social assistance rates to the fact that there is no social housing and no deeply affordable housing for people with the lowest incomes. And so this doesn't go to what I've just diagnosed at all. And then, you know, you mentioned the huge numbers of people living in homelessness. Another report came out this week from the Canadian Centre on Housing Rights, which used to be CERA, the Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation. And they've diagnosed a huge discrimination problem in the rental housing sector. And so even if there is a lot of supply and a lot of rental supply, if we have a major issue around discrimination where BIPOC tenants can't rent because of their characteristics, or people with disabilities, or single mothers, I don't see how any of what Mr. Clark has proposed through Bill 23 would address that.
Yeah, it's a fair points, and I could say from a service user at Blue Door, absolutely, to those points of when we stand up our clients against the middle income earner, right, trying to rent, if maybe their credit, maybe they're from a BIPOC community, and there's other challenges going on. It just, I mean, it's a business for someone, right? They're going to look at that, and it comes down to numbers. And you're right, when we're talking about 15% of Ontario's population receiving Ontario Works or ODSP, the Globe and Mail put out a while back that said if you're looking at 30% of your income as the threshold for what you should spend on housing, you need $90,000 to afford a one-bedroom apartment in the GTA. Now, that might be a bit of a stretch, but it's huge. And if you think of social assistance rates, people that are, with that having $7,000 to $13,000 a year in total income, the gap is huge, right? So we're not addressing that through this. And I think, John, we've talked about this before, even with before there was the Affordable Housing Task Force, and I think that was misnamed. That was, Leilani, to your point, let's not confuse supply and affordability. To John's point, there is some overlap. If you have more supply down the line, the theory is that things become more affordable, but affordable for who? Most likely not our most vulnerable, of course. So, we've heard a lot about this in the media over time. This was pushed through, and it was at a time too when across Ontario, many councils had just been elected or re-elected. They were coming to their first meeting. There was not a lot of time for deliberation or thoughts. Usually your first meeting as a council is pretty ceremonial. You're not doing a lot of work. Councils were forced into action, and we're not happy with this current design. I want to talk with both of you. What are the pieces in there from municipalities that you've seen and heard about that really have them up in arms? Leilani, we'll start with you this time, then go to John.
Yeah, although I think John is probably better to speak to this than I am, but I think municipalities are really concerned about the way in which development charges are dealt with in the bill, and the waiving of development charges, which is money that actually normally would go to a municipality to provide the much needed infrastructure to support the kind of development that the bill is trying to trigger. And everything from water and sewage to roads, and for the City of Toronto, for example, development charges were used, in fact, to support other affordable housing efforts that the city was making. And so with a big drop in income, cities are saying, what are we going to do? Now, if I recall, I did read a story, and you two are probably know better than me because I don't read Canadian news as much as I should. But I saw a story saying that the government is saying that they are going to make monies available to cities, but I don't know what that's going to look like, and will it be the amount that cities have come to rely upon through development charges?
Yes, that's I think you're referring to the affordable. They did something federally, yes, where they were going to roll some money to the municipalities. We don't know how much. We don't know if it's going to match or make people whole. It's uncertain, and so we'd have to hear more about that. John, your thoughts on some of the pieces that really are pushing municipalities' buttons?
So first of all, the change in development charges isn't an elimination of development charges. It's an elimination of the ability to use a development charge to raise money for housing services, was the sort of part of the act which allowed the City of Toronto to keep development charges in reserve and to apply it to affordable development. So today, Michael, for instance, if a nonprofit goes out and wants financing from the municipality to build, part of that financing is going to be relief of development charges it would otherwise pay, but also dollars per door put into the development, which has been funded when it's coming strictly from the City of Toronto or other municipalities through development charges. So in truth, it's not so much that it's development charges per se, it's that there's not only are they taking away that revenue, there's no replacement for it. So, it's a fair thing for the development industry to say development charges should pay for development, and we may bicker over whether or disagree over whether housing services should be part of the infrastructure of development. I can disagree with the development community on that. But at the end of the day, the source of money doesn't matter so much to me as that the money is there. And so often the response of the province to that, when you look at the act, is to say, well, it's okay because we've replaced that by taking all development charges off nonprofit housing. So if a nonprofit does a development now, there are no development charges whatsoever. But if you do 100% affordable housing now, you would enter into an agreement with the municipality in which you would be declared a municipal capital facility, and you would not pay development charges anyway. And so the net result is likely a reduction in the revenue line to any nonprofit development, which makes it harder to create low income housing through independent construction of nonprofits. So the biggest concern I have with this bill is that while I like supply too, I think it is important to have, and it is important to juice the industry in Ontario. It's the role of the government to ensure that some of that supply is being delivered at different income levels, and the collection of that collection of actions that I just went through makes it more difficult for nonprofits to create. And if you go to a couple of other elements which upset municipalities, they would be the changes in inclusionary zoning, which I'll get into if you ask me, but also the mandate to the minister to review the rental replacement rules, which really only applies in the city of Toronto, but essentially means that if you knock down a series of buildings, for example, think of a strip mall in Toronto, very classic to have a strip mall in Toronto with some residential up above it. If there's more than 6 units being knocked down, there's an obligation to replace those rental units. And that's an understood cost in the city of Toronto for all developers doing the city of Toronto. And as you look around, you can see that it's not slowing anybody down. So why take that away when it preserves affordable rental in place? One of the things that is very important for us to remember is that even today, we lose more rental units that are defined as affordable just through the development process than we can create by investing. And so that combination of things, of not retaining existing rental and make it more challenging for municipalities to engage in the funding of new below market rental, results in a problem for this bill in being able to address the need of housing at lower income brackets, where, by the way, there has been a housing crisis for longer than anyone in government has been calling housing crisis a crisis.
In fact, when you say that, it's funny. I recently heard Anna Bilal talk about that. She said, crisis has been around forever. She said when she took office in 2010, no one cared. She couldn't get, like, the media wasn't picking up on it. She said, in fact, it wasn't until the crisis hit the middle class that it now becomes a real issue and a contentious thing.
Well, I was standing beside you when she said that, Michael. And she's right, because the nature of the problem, the place where it now pinches, has moved up. The other thing to remember about this bill is this is the government doing what it can. It's not as though this bill alone changes the dynamics of housing construction today. It's still much more expensive than it was 3 years ago to build. It's harder to borrow money, and there's still a labor shortage. So all those things are playing into this difficulty.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, so there's it pushes the creation of 150,000 homes. It is obviously focused on supply and not affordability. There's not really any mention on how it will help solve homelessness. I don't think, obviously that's the focus. In fact, there's pieces of this that critics have said will increase homelessness and decrease affordability. It will actually kind of do the opposite. Any thoughts on that either?
Well, I think John talked about the fact that affordable units can be demolished and not replaced. Well, who's living in our most affordable units at this point in time? It's people with mostly people with the least amount of money. And so if we're not replacing those units, then where are those people going to go, and what's the downward spiral from there? So I think, that's just one example. I think, I actually think it's worse than we say, in that, like, at a time when there's a known housing crisis and when affordability has been identified as a key characteristic, or unaffordability, a key characteristic of the housing crisis, how could the government defend its decision to allow for affordable units to be demolished and not replaced? I mean, what's exceptionally disturbing from a human rights point of view, which is of course the frame that I use to analyze laws and policies, is there's a principle that we call non-retrogression in human rights law, and it's basically the idea that rights are supposed to be implemented progressively, and so every time you ratchet up and you get to a new level of enjoyment of a human right, you can't, as a government, take steps that are backward, that would put us backward. And obviously that provision that allows for the non-replacement of affordable units that are demolished is a retrogressive measure. And in human rights law, that's actually like one of those, there's certain things in human rights law you no way around it. It's a violation and it's really bad. It's a bright line in human rights law. That's one of them, non-retrogression. And so It's actually pretty shocking that Bill 23 would, proceed with that provision in it. And there was tons, in the deputations, there was a lot of pushback on that very particular article. Human rights law would say you have to replace it one for one. If you can demolish it, but you have to, one, make sure the tenants have somewhere to go in the interim when you're building new, and two, that they can return to a unit of similar space and at similar value or cost. And so, all of that is just, was clearly not of interest. But obviously that can easily lead to homelessness. I don't think people realize, like, if you're evicted or you lose your affordable home, where do you go in the city of Toronto, for example? Everything in your neighborhood is likely too expensive for you, so you get pushed out. You hear of people ending up in shelters or in rooming houses or in their cars, or, they avail themselves of family and friends until they can't any longer. And it can be a quick slope down into homelessness. I mean, I don't want to be too alarmist, but that is a reality. When you start talking to people living in homelessness, as Michael, you'll know this, and John, you'll know this. Everyone lived somewhere before they were homeless, and often it was in an affordable unit.
I mean, I've heard numbers when you talk about the supply. I've heard numbers that for every new build, we're losing 15 to crumbling infrastructure, rent evictions, that kind of thing. I've heard 7 to 1 as well. But definitely, we are not building new. Is not the only answer. We have to maintain what we have. And we've seen that through the Toronto community housing a number of years back, having to really scramble and get the dollars because there are thousands of units in need of repairs and the dollars to do so, right? So it's not just about building new, but maintaining as well. What about when we talk about, I know inclusionary zoning has been brought up, and there's different kind of versions of that. People have that or don't. But this bill really kind of throws that out. Any comments on that?
I'll make comments on that for sure. I mean, I'm just glad I'm not the guy who spent 5 years of my life figuring this out for the city of Toronto, only to wake up one day and see Bill 23. So inclusionary zoning takes a real hit here in this. If you compare the numbers, for example, the city of Toronto's policy was a 15 to 20% sense at its most in the ownership world, was a 99-year commitment. And the accessibility to those units was based on income, not a average market rent measure. The legislation changes that, puts a cap on the set aside to 5%, puts a limit on the years to 25, and returns to a measure which had been used in affordable housing for some time, namely 80% of average market rent for the city of Toronto. So it is a measurable, more easily digestible chunk for a developer to take at this point in time. And there are really those who argue that the city's approach was too much, too fast, and should have been sort of phased in a bit more. And it is absolutely fair to say that it would have been better to bring inclusionary zoning in 5 years ago when we had more stable interest rates and better cost structures. But be that as it may, you can see the extent to which, as a regulatory answer to what Leilani has been talking about, where the city of Toronto takes a progressive measure, that this is a direct step back. So instead of saying these units are going to be based on an average income in Toronto, it's based on average market rent. So if you can appreciate it, the law turns on where you draw the line around the area that is defining average market rent. So the average market rent in the city of Toronto is such that 80% of it is market rent in many parts of Toronto, and probably above market rent in many parts of Toronto. So you'd be getting concessions for not really providing greater affordability in those parts of the city. So there's a lot of worry about that, and certainly the municipalities would be right to be upset at having had that policy overturned. And these things are cumulative, so it's really a collection of, okay, how does the city deliver then units at below market when successively inclusionary zoning and then rental replacement and their ability to fund nonprofits is sort of systematically removed from them in this way. And let me be clear, so I don't want to go back what I've said before. the overall direction to create supply, in my mind, is a good thing, and the government should be looking to do that. But it's the responsibility of government to push the supply into levels of income that are not going to be able to get housing at market rates.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I was just watching Ian Underwood from Habitat, she was talking about from start to finish that a lot of the projects with Habitat, who is a known entity, has that kind of political power and has the resources 7 years from start to finish, right, to create housing. So, you know, the hope is we talk about moving things along faster. I think, well, Lenny, you said, of course we can. We need to do that. There are some silly things getting in the way of, you know, getting things approved, taking 3 years to approve plans, et cetera, right, going through. But one can see why, you know, people would be so upset about this. Now, one of the parts is kicking up a lot of controversy, of course, is during the election, I think it was back in 2018, Doug Ford, it said there was some recording of him talking about the Greenbelt, opening it up. He said, absolutely not. We're not going to touch the Greenbelt. Bill 23, they are opening up the Greenbelt. Is this necessary? Is this a big part of it? You know, why are people, I'm asking you questions that sound silly, but like, why so upset? Like, if we're trying to build housing, is it necessary to use all means possible? We're in a crisis, right? Go ahead, Leilani.
Hey, sorry, getting all these lots of boxes coming up on my screen. My apologies. Michael, if you don't mind, can I just go back to the inclusionary zoning thing, which John explained it. John's answer to that was so excellent, and he explained it so clearly. So thank you, John, for that. It's so out of step with what other cities, nations, etc. are doing around inclusionary zoning. To limit it to 5% at 25 years. Take, for example, now this may be the high water mark, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, but in Munich, in Germany, last year they passed a law that requires 60% inclusionary zoning. 60, that's 60. And of it, a huge proportion has to be social, and then a smaller portion has to be affordable, and then a smaller portion that is middle income. So that's how they've divvied it up. But 60%, and where Premier Ford and Mr. Clark come up with 5%, it's just like they pulled it out of a hat, or maybe they sat with developers and that's what developers whittled it down to. And 25 years, do they know something about poverty in this country that I don't know? I mean, I don't know. I was the executive director of an anti-poverty organization for 12 years, and I don't see poverty ending in 25 years. So where would they come up with this 25 years, right? These are just sweet numbers for developers. So I just wanted to put that out there because it's just out of step. If you look, most people now are using Montreal as one of the best examples in the country for inclusionary zoning. The way they've done it is 20-20-20, 20% social, 20% affordable, 20% family units. And if a developer balks at that, they can say no, but they have to pay into a fund for affordable housing, and then the city then uses that money to build more affordable housing. So I just wanted to put that out there. And the other thing I wanted to say about supply, and I'm sorry, I'm derailing us here. I mean, Greenbelt's important, but and I know John's dying to talk about the Greenbelt. But on the issue of supply, what I find quite shocking, and this might be too anecdotal for people and not scientific enough, but you know, like, what about existing supply that isn't being used for the right ends, to help solve the housing crisis? And here's the anecdote. So a few weekends ago, I needed to be in Toronto for one night with my daughter so we could check out U of T. And I went on booking.com to try to find a hotel. And the first 5 or 10 listings were hotels, the regular ones. And then almost every listing after that was a condo being rented on a per nightly basis at $200 a night, $150 a night. And there were so many of those listings, so many. So like, there's an example, like, there's supply. How could a government creatively harness that kind of supply, condos for rent, Airbnb units that aren't being rented, et cetera, et cetera. So I just put that out there.
So that's a really important, fair point, because to a certain extent, the supply mechanisms that are being used in Bill 23 need a companion piece, and the companion piece is it's all getting used as well as possible. So that can mean Airbnb. It can mean heavy taxation on vacant units. It can mean that kind of thing. Then that companion piece is still not there for Ontario. So they should be looking at trying to cover that off, and that if you produce a unit that isn't used as a home, you haven't solved anything.
Yeah, well said. Thanks for bringing us back around to that, and some good points around supply. Let's go back to the Greenbelt, John.
So it's you can tell my personal focus, because I'm so alive to the pro forma of the nonprofit developers, and probably a little more sympathetic than my friend Leilani to the pro forma of the for-profit developers in the immediate here and now, and it's so challenging to actually get a project going. That my sense of the Greenbelt is the reaction is because Mr. Ford said something different, and now there appears to be a push to break that promise and use up some of the Greenbelt. But I do think some of the discussion is a little more than is there, and to the extent that an independent body could swap one piece of environmentally sensitive land for another piece where development makes sense because it's very close. Personally, I have an openness to that. So I'm probably not as adamant about that as I am about rental replacement and so on. Everybody picks their battles in this legislation.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah. I think John and I concur on that. Actually, it's not to say that I think, oh yeah, eat up the Greenbelt, but maybe it is possible to swap. I don't know. To me, the issue was process. It's as John said. The Premier said one thing and did another. There's this awful feeling that certain people were tipped off, and that's a sign of corruption, and that's a very serious charge to have leveled against you if you're Premier of a province, and let the environmentalists into the conversation and have a proper dialogue, engagement, etc. around best uses of the Greenbelt. How can the Greenbelt be saved and used to help solve the housing crisis? Are there other ways, etc.? So I don't know. Is the Greenbelt untouchable? It's not for me to say. I'm not an environmentalist. I don't know much about the Greenbelt, but it seems to me that there was a very, very poor and potentially corrupt process that unfolded, and that's the problem.
Yes, I think you both bring up good points. You said one thing, you did another. I think the other day, Premier Ford said, "Hey, to the NDP, you're hypocrites. You did the same thing." And then if you look at the numbers, so much lesser extent, it was very minimal to what's being proposed now. I got to think, like, when you talk about a lot of this, when I look at the design of this bill, when you're saying who decide, I got to think, you have to think that developers sat down and said, or were part of the process that were saying, here are my pain points. 25 or 99 years is too much. The development charges are too high. What is stopping you from pushing forward harder to get 150,000 homes built? And that was part of the discussion was, around the cost. How do we get costs down? Certainly when we talk about development charges, I don't hear a lot about, or no one's really talked about those savings being passed down to the end user of the homes being built. But it just really is around speed of process. And I've got to think, like we talked about it, the only real winners, and there's some, as John says, supply is good, trickle down maybe some years later, but the real winners out of this have to be the build community, the developers. They must be really happy that this is pushing through.
Well, we know that's true because we hear Dave Wilkes and other representatives of the development community say so. But in fairness, like, it is very challenging to get a project off the ground right now. But part of the issue in my mind is, okay, that's the pain point now. why are we not talking about this for a certain period of time in order to do that? And as a result, saying we're going to lock in forever concessions which are related to a particular crisis that is in existence today. So I would have. I think these are important concessions to a certain extent, but they should be part of a longer term plan, which allows us to feel like, why aren't we phasing in more inclusion? If the pain point was it's too much too soon, why aren't we phasing this in over 5, 6, 10 years, whatever, so that at some point in time we are achieving 10 or 15% set asides for that? Like, those would be important considerations. And as these things become baked into the plan, they become easier to recover. It does mean that if you own land, it's worth less than it was before, because it costs more to build on it, and there's less revenue that comes from it. But so what? So I think those things could have been drawn out a little bit better. I think there's a couple other interesting parts of the act which are very positive too, like the density requirements near transit sites, the density along boulevards. Those are all positive things which allow developers to build. Moving forward towards being able to build 6-story and 8-story wood structure buildings, important things for the development community to be able to provide more housing at a cost level that allows them to recuperate fair return, to compensate them for risk, which they definitely take. I'm a real estate lawyer. I see the risks that developers take all the time, and I've seen some of them have those risks bite them, and you don't hear about them anymore for obvious reasons. So those were positive pieces in my view. But the elements which don't push or have a plan to push some of the supply over time into lower income brackets is a miss on the part of the government. And I think that they need to reconsider that part. The direction with respect to rental replacement is not an elimination of it today. It's a direction of the minister to give some thought and direction. And I hope he will listen to this podcast and reconsider his the initial view which we seem to have, and give some thought to the fact that this is not slowing anybody down, and it keeps affordable units in the same part of Toronto where they are today. Those are good things. So I'm going to stop talking about rental replacement and for the rest of this podcast, though, so you won't have to hear about me on that again. But I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, and I can't tell if am I mic'd? Yes. Sorry, no pop-up this time. I very much agree with what John just said. I think, Michael, what's lacking, and I think this is in step with what John just said. What's lacking is kind of vision. The Premier has said, housing, economics 101, supply and demand. There's a lot of demand, we're going to meet it with supply. I mean, he said that, right? Which is, one, erroneous. We all know now that housing does not function in the way other commodities function. It is absolutely not economics 101. And I think, Canada is one of the best examples of that. But just like a lack of vision of the kind of cities the Conservatives want to grow in this province. And like John gave the example, which I agree, more density along transit lines. Okay, well, I live in Ottawa. I live right near the new LRT, which has had many problems, but nevertheless, it's being built and it's cool. And they're trying to build more density along the transit line. Well, what kind of density? What does that look like? Well, I'll tell you what it looks like in Ottawa. It looks like a whole bunch of skyscrapers, 30 stories, totally disproportionate to the area, but whatever. Okay, we want more density, fine. Well, what has to anchor a building, and this happens in Toronto too, right? When you get those big condo buildings, what do they need anchoring in terms of retail at the bottom? Well, it ends up being some big multinational, Shoppers Drug Mart, Starbucks, a bank, right? And that is money that then what that means is the people who are living in those buildings, who use those retail, who go into that Starbucks, who go into that Shoppers Drug Mart, their money is going into that business and right out of the community, and in fact out of the country. So is that the vision that we have for our cities? I don't know. To me, Bill 23 really has no vision. The same with the green belt. People care about nature and green belts now for a very good reason. We're suffering climate change, right? And the effects of climate change. Where is the vision around that? Okay, I'll stop.
No, it's you know, I love those points around, you know, it's not, you've got to think this through all the way, not part way, and charge right through with that. Okay, so the province says, you know what, Leilani and John, you know, we're rethinking this. We want to make this better. Sit down, give us your top 3 thoughts on how could we make this bill better. You know, we put it through, but we're still open. We still want to. How does everyone benefit? How do we make municipalities a little more whole with this? What are some changes that we can make? Because here's the thing too, is that sometimes I think with society, what we see is, you know, yes, we've over-regulated to hell, like everything, right? We put in so many, for good reasons, many times. And then this is an example of let's take like swing too much the other way, which is dangerous, right? So where do we meet? What are your top 3? They're sitting down with you. What do you advise? How do we make this better?
You go first, John? You go first, John. You go first.
All right. So, well, first I would start by quoting my dad. I would say you can't have laissez-faire without some savoir-faire to guide it. And I would say, first, existing affordable stock counts, and it needs to be protected one way or another. And there are several ways of doing that, including its transfer into the nonprofit world or advantageous purchase or any number of other things. I've talked ad nauseum about the one-way rental replacement, but there are others as well to protect existing stock. Existing stock counts. Second, I would say that the creation and support of a robust nonprofit community and co-op community is important to create the next level of housing. I also think that they should be looking to inclusionary zoning and other methods within the private sector to allow for affordable housing. Remember, affordable housing is not deep housing that solves the issues of people with deep poverty. So within the private space, we have affordable units and then an investment in supportive housing and community housing for those who need it. I worked at Toronto Community Housing for 7 years. I know that sometimes there's massive amounts of money that come in and it takes a long time to actually spend it and for people to see it. But be that as it may, everyone who lives there also deserves a safe, secure place to live. And I know they do their best because I've worked there and I know how hard it is, and I have a lot of respect for what goes on. But investment in those buildings is important as well. So those would be the 3 things I'd be leading with.
Thanks, John. Leilani?
That's a hard act to follow.
Did you take your 3?
Yeah. No. Well, sort of, but no. But also quoting his father. I mean, you know,
it's not
if
fair,
I'm going to quote my father, I'm taking us in a totally different direction. I'll leave it at that. Here's how what I would suggest. I think that a new Bill 23, maybe Bill 24, would articulate that housing is a fundamental human right as understood under international human rights law, and that the province has obligations in that regard, and that would be the foundation for the act. And or the bill, excuse me. And from there, so the idea would be that the bill would produce human rights outcomes. And from there would be a real emphasis on preserving existing affordable stock, which John has talked about at some length. The second would be a requirement of specific targets and timelines for a certain amount of social housing and deeply affordable housing to be provided by nonprofits, and where there's a fail, where targets aren't being met, the government would step in to bolster and support and figure out how to meet those targets. And then the third thing would be provisions around using inappropriately used existing stock. As John said, if it's not being used for a home, then it has to be looked at and repurposed as a home somehow.
Excellent. Both of you, some changes, some additions, some complementary pieces, and we could have a pretty decent bill that most people would win with. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts before we wrap up the conversation around this bill? Thoughts moving forward?
Not really.
I already used up my dad quote. So yeah, thanks, Dad. And yeah, it is. I mean, it's something that gets a lot of people's attention because it's so personal to so many people. But I do think that one of the critical things to remember is that when we talk about the housing crisis in general, you do have to ask, just as you started with, Michael, whose housing crisis are we actually talking about here? So for the people, the men and women who use Blue Door, for instance, they have not seen a change in their housing crisis in the last 3 or 4 years. That housing crisis has existed, it continues to exist, and they face challenges which you and your staff are amazingly qualified to deal with in the work that you guys do. And so I guess if I had a parting word, it would be to say, I know that our audience here is a fairly Hauser type audience, but I'd ask, and I'd say this on any other podcast I'd ask that you remember when we talk about the housing crisis that for supply to work, it has to push down, and there's more than just the people at the very edge of the market level that need to be provided with some assistance in order to ensure that we all get accommodation. So if you want to take the totally right-wing approach, as long as you don't think people should be out in the cold in the dead of winter, and you think you want to do this efficiently, well, I can tell you that housing is a lot less expensive than shelters, which is a lot less expensive than hospitals. So this is the kind of thing we have to pay attention to. And if Bill 23 stands alone, then it's not providing that second level. I've said it before, I like the bill for the supply parts. I'm looking for the rest.
So you're telling me that affordable housing not only saves dollars, but saves lives? There you go.
Michael, affordable housing saves dollars and it saves lives.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Oh. Absolutely.
Yes. And if you don't mind a plug for you guys, if you go on your website right now, you will be able to save lives by buying winter coats as a Christmas present for your clients instead of sending around baskets and stuff like that. It's a great idea you guys have, and I think we have actually decided today to do that. Go online and buy some winter coats for your folks.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I mean, I have to tell you both. When I talk to my team, they are telling me that they are seeing this kind of different shelter user too, or I mean, you've got people who are working full time in the shelter system, and they don't need round the clock 24-hour care. It's just that's their only option. They don't have the housing option. They just can't simply afford rents and housing, right? And we're seeing more and more of that. So yes, this is quite troubling. But listen, with both of you and so many others across the country that are doing brilliant work, pushing. And hopefully we will see the actualization of housing as a human right, right? That's that into action. And I know Leilani, you and so many others are pushing forward with that. And we have great faith in that. Better times are ahead. I truly believe that. I'm an optimist. Someone asked me recently, said, why do you stay in this work? Which is odd. But I said, because I truly believe it's really solvable. It may not be in my lifetime in this work, but it will be hopefully in my lifetime and it was with a bunch of students said, you're going to do the heavy lifting. But if we could be a part of kind of setting the direction, that would be great. But it is a very solvable thing. I think as we charge forward and try and solve some of these things, it has to be planful. It has to be, Leilani, your words, with vision, like a bigger vision. Because if we don't do that, sometimes we cause more damage than good. Thank you both for your time today. I know you're extremely busy people. Thanks for your dedication to the sector, for all you do. And hopefully we will see you again and you'll become members of the Five Timers Club here on the way home.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, John.
Well, I have to be honest, I was really excited about this conversation coming in, just because been reading and hearing so much about this. I love the two different perspectives, right? I think, no one has really talked about that, the lens of housing as a human right, and how this is basically ignored through this bill. And for John to unpack so many different pieces of that, sometimes when we don't go in depth, we misread, his piece about development charges too. I think It's so informative. And I'm so grateful for both of them for the work they continue to do in this sector as change makers. A good time, as always. I hope you enjoyed it. I guarantee you'll enjoy our next guest when we see you next time on The Way Home.